For centuries, we've been taught to look for power in the obvious places: crowns, thrones, armies, flags, raised over conquered land. But one of the most powerful forces in medieval Europe had none of those things. No king, no capital, no standing army, no single ruler. And yet it shaped prices, dictated access to markets, punished kings, and decided which cities prospered and which withered from London to the edges of the Baltic. It wasn't an empire. It was a network, a cartel of merchants who figured out something most rulers hadn't. If you control trade, you don't need to control territory. Power comes to you anyway. If you love the real stories behind money and power, hit like and subscribe before we go on. Now let's dive in. To understand how the Hanseatic League came into existence, strip away the romantic image of medieval Europe. This was not a continent of stable kingdoms and orderly markets. It was fragmented, violent, and unreliable. After the collapse of Roman authority, Northern Europe became a patchwork of weak states, competing princes, and feudal claims layered on top of one another. Borders shifted constantly. Laws changed the moment you crossed a river. Justice depended on who controlled the road you stood on. For merchants, this wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Ships faced piracy in the North Sea and the Baltic. Caravans faced tolls, confiscation, or outright robbery. A merchant could load a ship with grain or timber and lose everything before reaching the next port, not because demand wasn't there, but because protection wasn't. Kings were happy to tax trade passing through their lands, but far less interested in guaranteeing its safety once it moved beyond their reach. Contracts meant little across borders. If a deal went wrong in a foreign city, there was often no court willing or able to enforce it. And yet the profits were too large to ignore. Northern Europe was rich in exactly what the rest of the continent needed: timber, grain, furs, amber, fish, salt, wool. Demand was rising, cities were growing, and trade routes were forming whether rulers liked it or not. The problem wasn't demand. It was trust. Trust between strangers, across languages, laws, and loyalties. And trust, in this world, was in short supply. Merchants faced a choice: accept permanent vulnerability or build their own system of protection. The earliest seeds of the Hanseatic League weren't ideological or political. They were practical. In the 12th century, merchants from cities like Lübeck and Hamburg began cooperating informally. They shared ships for safety, traveled in convoys, and warned each other about hostile ports, corrupt officials, and dangerous waters. End quote. What began as mutual aid quickly evolved into something more strategic. Cooperation reduced risk. Reduced risk meant lower costs. Lower costs meant higher profits. And once merchants realized collaboration paid better than competition, the logic became impossible to ignore. Over time, these relationships hardened. Cities that hosted and protected merchants gained access to goods, capital, and connections. Cities that didn't found themselves bypassed. Trade routes didn't just reflect geography, they reflected trust, and trust clustered around specific ports. Lübeck, at a crucial crossroads between the Baltic and inland Europe, became one of the earliest hubs. Hamburg linked river trade to the North Sea. These cities weren't powerful because they had armies. They were powerful because they were unavoidable. And no one designed a Hanseatic League. There was no founding charter, no declaration, no moment where someone announced a new power block. It emerged the way markets often do, organically, driven by incentives. Merchants aligned because it made economic sense. Cities supported them because trade brought wealth. Alignment turned into expectation, expectation into rules, and rules into leverage. As these networks expanded, something subtle but critical happened. Trade stopped being just an economic activity and became an organizing principle. If enough merchants refused to trade with a city, that city suffered. Prices rose, supplies dried up, revenue collapsed. Cooperation wasn't enforced with violence, at least not at first. It was enforced through exclusion, and exclusion, in a world dependent on trade, was devastating. This was the quiet genius of the League. It didn't try to replace states, it worked around them. It didn't overthrow rulers, it made them dependent. Kings might control land, but merchants controlled access, and access to grain, timber, salt, and credit mattered more than banners flying over castles. Slowly, almost invisibly, economic coordination began to outweigh political authority. By the 13th century, these alliances spanned dozens of cities across Northern Europe. They spoke different languages and answered to different rulers, but in trade they acted as one not because they were ordered to, but because the system rewarded those who complied and punished those who didn't. This was a new kind of power, one that needed no legitimacy from God or lineage, no conquest, a power rooted in logistics, trust, and collective enforcement. And they weren't just cooperating anymore, they were coordinating, standardizing contracts, weights, measures, and practices across cities with nothing in common politically. A deal struck in Bruges could be understood in Bremen. Prices quoted in Riga made sense in Cologne. This wasn't cultural harmony. It was economic alignment, and it reduced friction in ways medieval states couldn't match. The League also institutionalized its presence abroad. In key foreign cities, it established trading enclaves called contours semi-autonomous districts that operated under Hanseatic rules, not local ones. London had the Steelyard. Bruges, Antwerp, and Novgorod became crucial nodes. They housed merchants, stored goods, resolved disputes internally, and negotiated collectively. If a foreign ruler wanted access to Hanseatic trade, they dealt with the group, not individuals. And that mattered because once negotiations were collective, leverage shifted. A single merchant could be coerced, taxed, or ignored. A coordinated network controlling essential trade flows could not. When disputes arose, the League responded not with petitions, but with pressure. If a city mistreated its merchants or broke terms, the response was swift. Trade stopped, ships were rerouted, goods disappeared. This was economic warfare without bloodshed most of the time. The brilliance lay in how little it relied on force. Violence was expensive. Armies required funding, loyalty, and maintenance. The League preferred something cleaner: denial, exclusion, and boycotts. These didn't require soldiers. They required discipline, and discipline was enforced not by ideology, but by profit. Cities that broke ranks lost access. Merchants who violated rules found themselves isolated. Compliance wasn't moral, it was rational. And rulers learned this the hard way, granting privileges and protections to Hanseatic merchants not out of generosity, but necessity. Northern Europe depended on the goods the League controlled: grain to feed cities, timber for shipbuilding, salt for food preservation. The League sat at the choke points of all three. When conflicts arose, rulers discovered that sovereignty meant little if markets turned against them. This didn't mean the League was universally loved. Local merchants resented its dominance. Rulers bristled at its autonomy. Excluded cities accused it of monopolistic behavior, which, in fairness, wasn't wrong. It fixed prices, restricted access, and coordinated supply. By any modern definition, it behaved like a cartel. The difference was that no authority was strong enough to stop it. And here's the uncomfortable part. The League didn't become powerful because it was corrupt or conspiratorial. It became powerful because it solved a problem no one else could. In a world without reliable states, it provided reliability. Without enforceable law, it enforced norms. Without security, it reduced risk. People didn't submit to the system because they were forced to. They participated because the alternative was worse. And once an institution controls access like that, it doesn't need a crown to rule. By the 14th century, the League acted openly as a political force. When Danish kings threatened Hanseatic interests in the Baltic, the League didn't appeal to a higher authority. It raised fleets, blockaded ports, and negotiated treaties on equal footing with monarchs. The war against King Valdemar IV of Denmark ended not with his victory, but with concessions to the League. Trade privileges were secured, autonomy was preserved. A loose coalition of merchants had bent a crown to its will. And yet, even at its height, the League never became a state. It had no capital, no permanent treasury, no unified military command. Its meetings were irregular, attendance voluntary, decisions slow and contentious. On paper, it looked fragile. In practice, it endured for centuries because its strength came not from centralization, but from alignment. It was held together by a shared understanding. Protect the system, and the system protects you. That proved more durable than loyalty to any single ruler. Cities rose and fell, dynasties collapsed, borders shifted, and the League adapted, rerouted trade, shifted hubs, absorbed shocks. It behaved less like a government and more like a market organism, responsive, pragmatic, and ruthlessly focused on survival. But this adaptability carried a hidden cost. As the League grew more entrenched, it grew more conservative. Rules that once enabled growth began to resist change. New competitors emerged. Southern trade routes expanded. Atlantic commerce began to eclipse the Baltic. States started centralizing power, building navies, enforcing laws, and issuing credit on a scale merchants could no longer outmaneuver. The very governments the League had once outperformed were catching up. The Hanseatic League didn't collapse in a dramatic moment. It faded slowly, quietly, as incentives shifted and the balance between state power and market power recalibrated. But the lesson it leaves behind is sharper than ever. You don't need sovereignty to wield power, you need coordination. You don't need armies if you control access. And you don't need ideology when incentives do the work for you. The Hanseatic League didn't rule Northern Europe by decree, it ruled it by necessity. And that is often the most durable form of control there is. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If this gave you a new perspective on how money and power really work, hit like and subscribe, because history always has the answers. You just have to know where to look.